Comrades and friends, May Day 2018 is invested with special significance because we are celebrating not only the Day of International Working Class Solidarity, but also the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx. There is no element of exaggeration in the assertion that in the realm of philosophy, economic science, historiography, social theory, and politics, Marx is the most significant figure of the modern era. There is not another thinker who has exerted such a great, enduring, and progressive influence on the development of the social consciousness of humanity and its struggle against oppression and exploitation. Marx's work initiated a new epoch in mankind's understanding of the objective forces that determine the course of historical development, and thus made possible the conscious struggle of the working class for the socialist transformation of society. On the basis of his refutation of Hegel's objective idealism and the critical appropriation of its dialectical methodology, Marx was able to develop philosophical materialism and apply it to the study of man's socioeconomic and political evolution. Prior to Marx, even the most advanced thinkers, above all Hegel and Feuerbach, the greatest of Marx's immediate predecessors, derived social and political relations from some sort of ideal inspiration, be it spiritual or intellectual. Even the great materialist thinkers of the 18th century, such as Helvetius and Baron d'Holbach, whose writings played a critical role in preparing the ground for the great French Revolution of 1789 to 94, believed that the social and political environment was determined by public opinion, that is, by thought. But the idealist conception that social relations are the product of thought is contradicted by reality. Human beings, in their real historical existence, are born into, confront, and adapt themselves unconsciously to the prevailing social relations. Marx, the greatest of all materialist philosophers, uncovered the real origin of man's thought and ideological conceptions, and, as Lenin later explained so concisely, proved that the, quote, conclusion that the course of ideas depends on the course of things is the only one compatible with scientific psychology, end of quote. In his initial elaboration of the materialist conception of history and its subsequent substantiation in the writing of Das Kapital, Marx identified, amidst the seemingly uncoordinated actions of countless millions of human beings, each pursuing what they believed to be their own best interests, driven by their individual passions, ambitions, and contradictory aspirations, those objective forces operating apart from and even independently of individual subjective consciousness that underlie and determine the economic structure of society. Marx rejected any resort to idealist subjectivism in explaining the development of consciousness. Even false conceptions of the nature of society are rooted in and are reflections of objective conditions that exist independently of individuals. Man's inability to perceive and comprehend on the basis of direct and immediate observation the exploitative character of capitalist social relations cannot be explained as a failure of the individual intellect. Rather, it arises from what Marx referred to as the enigmatical character acquired by the products of labor when they assume the form of commodities. As commodities, Marx wrote, a definite social relation between men necessarily assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of relations between things. Marx and his lifelong friend and collaborator, the genius Friedrich Engels, did not invent socialism. The term came into usage as early as the 1830s. Saint-Simon, Owen, and Fourier in particular, have entered into history as the utopian precursors of Marx and Engels. These remarkable thinkers did not lack for brilliant insights into the defects of existing society and proposals for its more rational organization. But what was absent from their conceptions was an explanation of the objective socio-economic processes from which socialism would actually emerge, and the identification of the social force that would fight for its realization. As Marx later recalled, he and Engels, and I quote, proposed a scientific study of the economic structure of bourgeois society as the only tenable theoretical foundation for the fight for socialism, and argued in popular form that it was not a matter of putting some utopian system into effect, but of conscious participation in the historical process revolutionizing society before our very eyes. In explaining the significance of his theoretical work, Marx, somewhat modestly, identified three critical and interrelated achievements. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Three, that this dictatorship itself constitutes no more than a transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. As the bicentenary of Marx's birth has approached, there has been no shortage of assessments by academics and journalists of the significance of his life. The economic disaster of 2008 is still fresh in everyone's memory. Only incorrigible anti-communist reactionaries, blinded by hatred and greed, can deny the monumental scale of Marx's works. Even the phrase, "Marx was right," has appeared fairly frequently. The more intellectually conscientious academics have conducted painstaking research to refute attacks by conventional bourgeois economists on critical elements of Marx's work, such as the labor theory of value and his analysis of the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. Such serious intellectual work should be welcomed and encouraged. However, even the more generous acknowledgments of Marx's genius are constrained by efforts to isolate his theoretical work from its practical political, that is, contemporary revolutionary implications. One or another aspect of Marx's work is lauded as relevant to an understanding of present-day economic conditions. But the appreciation of Marx, the economic theorist, is usually rigidly separated from Marxism as the theory, program, and practice of world socialist revolution. Much of the discussion of the relevance of Marx is dominated and distorted by this strict separation of the consideration of Marx's economic critique of capitalism from the recognition of the enduring significance of Marxism as the historical and contemporary international political movement of the most advanced sections of the working class from the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system. This separation of Marx, the economic theorist, from the socialist revolutionary has a long history. In the course of more than a century, countless efforts have been made to trim Marx's beard, that is, to reconcile Marx with one or another form of bourgeois ideology and petty bourgeois opportunist reformism. Edward Bernstein seized on the opportunity provided by Engels' death in 1895 to disassociate Marxism from socialist revolution and to convert international socialism into nothing more than a movement for social reforms. In the course of the 20th century, the revisions of Marxism assumed an increasingly reactionary character, serving more or less openly as a means of divesting it of any real revolutionary significance and converting it into an apologia for the national opportunism of the mass social democratic and Stalinist parties and the trade unions. The assault on Marx's legacy was facilitated by the unrelenting efforts of petty bourgeois theorists to undermine and discredit the materialist foundations of his theoretical work. As early as the 1890s, barely a decade after his death, German professors were eager to reconcile Marx's revolutionary morality based on the logic of class struggle with Kant's suprahistorical categorical imperative. From the very beginning of the 20th century, reflecting the increasing influence of philosophical irrationalism upon broad sections of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia, Marx's insistence on the objective and law-governed character of the historical process came under attack. Thinkers such as Georges Sorel and later Henri de Man claimed that workers required the inspiration of myths, not knowledge of objective laws governing the development of the class struggle against capitalism, to inspire the fight for socialism. Insight into unconscious psychological motivations, rather than the analysis and comprehension of objective economic forces, were declared to be essential for winning workers to the socialist movement. The flight of petty bourgeois intellectuals into irrationalism was combined with an attack on Engels as a vulgar materialist and positivist who had supposedly concealed the individualist and humanist elements of Marxist thought. The young Marx of the philosophical manuscripts of 1844 was elevated above the old Marx of Das Kapital. The main aim of the assault, which has persisted under the influence of Nietzscheanism, existentialism, the Frankfurt School's dilution of materialism with Freudian pseudoscience, and the irrationalist and anti-historical intellectual nihilism of postmodernism, has been to suppress the essential revolutionary content of Marx's work. The intelligence agencies of the capitalist state have not stood on the sidelines in the ideological war against Marxism. The British newspaper, The Independent, in an article published just yesterday, calls attention to a recently declassified CIA research paper. The agency, it reveals, and I quote, read French postmodern theory, concluding that its questioning of the objective basis of reality could be used to undermine the Marxist doctrine of historical inevitability. Millions of dollars were pumped into front organizations such as magazines, publishing houses, and favored academics in order to push postmodern ideas and to create a center-left, thus demarcating the outer boundary of respectable ideas, anything beyond which could be denounced as dangerous and radical lunacy, or perhaps as sectarianism. Thus, the separation of Marx the theoretician from Marx the revolutionary must lead to falsification, first and foremost of Marx's biography. Marx the thinker cannot be understood apart from his political development and activity as a revolutionist. As Franz Mehring observed in his biography of Marx, written 100 years ago, there is no doubt that the incomparable stature of Marx is due not a little to the fact that in him, the man of ideas was indissolubly bound up with the man of action, and that the two mutually complemented and supported each other. As early as March 1843, Marx wrote to Arnold Ruge, I quote, Feuerbach's aphorisms seem to me incorrect only in one respect, that he refers too much to nature and too little to politics. That, however, is the only alliance by which present-day philosophy can become truth. End of quote. This was not a passing phrase, but the key to understanding the essential relation between philosophy and politics in both Marx's work and in the contemporary world. In his thesis on Feuerbach, Marx wrote, the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e., the reality and power, this worldliness of his thinking, in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking, which isolates itself from practice, is a purely scholastic question. End of quote. Philosophy, separated from revolutionary politics, the struggle against the oppression of man by man, is idle speculation, without progressive significance. But politics, without a firm basis in revolutionary theory and knowledge of its development, in the course of the long history of the international workers' movement and the struggle for socialism can lead only to impotent improvisations and outright betrayal. Marx died on March 14, 1883, at the age of 64. Speaking at his graveside, Engels described his beloved friend and comrade in arms as a man of science. But he added, and I quote, "This was not even half the man. Marx was before all else a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute in one way or another to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat, which he was the first to make conscious of its own position and its needs, conscious of the conditions of its emancipation. Fighting was his element, and he fought with a passion, a tenacity, and success such as few could rival." Marx, the man, died 135 years ago. Marxism, understood as the application of dialectical and historical materialist methodology to the study of continuously changing objective socioeconomic conditions, as a science of revolutionary political perspective oriented toward the conquest of political power by the working class, the ending of capitalist exploitation, the abolition of the nation-state system, and the establishment of a socialist society on a world scale, can only be properly understood in its relation to the historical development of the class struggle and the international socialist movement. Engels once wrote that with every advance in the natural sciences, materialism must change its form. That is, it must incorporate into its understanding of the material universe the latest advances in physics, chemistry, evolutionary biology, and mathematics. In like manner, Marxism, as a science devoted specifically to the development of capitalist society, develops through the critical and continuous examination of changes in the capitalist mode of production on a world scale, and through participation in and the critical assimilation of the experiences of the class struggle on an international scale. All invocations of dialectics that exclude this critical element of Marxism, that ignores or glosses over the lessons of the revolutionary struggles of the past century, are nothing but an exercise in empty phrase-mongering and petty bourgeois political charlatanry. The celebration of the bicentenary of Marx's birth is of genuine revolutionary political significance only to the extent that it is based on the whole historical development of Marxism. In the course of the 20th century, the working class passed through monumental historical experiences of imperialist wars, of revolutions and counter-revolutions. Marxism does not exist in the abstract or as a set of conclusions formulated more than a century ago. Rather, it exists as the real movement that represents the continuity of the conscious struggle within the international working class to develop the program, perspective, and practice of world socialist revolution. In 1938, Leon Trotsky founded the Fourth International in revolutionary opposition to the counter-revolutionary Stalinist bureaucracy, whose betrayals had led to catastrophic defeats of the working class. In the course of 80 years, the Fourth International has passed through tumultuous struggles, not only against the counter-revolutionary parties and organizations of the Stalinists and social democratic bureaucracies, but also against the many forms of opportunism, centrism, and pseudo-leftism that reflect the pressure of the capitalist class and imperialism upon the working class. It is in the struggle against all these forces that the Fourth International, led by the International Committee, has defended and developed Marxism. As we celebrate May Day 2018, there are growing signs that a new period of mass revolutionary struggles by the working class has begun. As is usually the case, the emergence of the working class on the scene of history comes as a surprise, above all to the representatives of the pseudo-left and the anti-Marxist academics whose intellectual and political conceptions are based on the total rejection of the working class as a revolutionary force, and therefore a no less total belief in the permanence of capitalism. But all that is irrational, all that exists in defiance of the needs of the progressive development of human civilization is unreal. That is, it is condemned by virtue of its own insoluble contradictions to historical oblivion. This sentence has been imposed on capitalist society. It remains to be executed. But has there ever been another ruling class that has displayed such obvious signs of social parasitism, political disorientation, intellectual exhaustion, and moral breakdown? Compared to today's international mafia of oligarchs who control and consume a vast portion of the wealth produced by the labor of billions of people, the bourgeoisie of Marx's era appear almost as a respectable fraternity of philanthropists. The claims of decrepit reformists like Sanders and Corbyn that the capitalist oligarchs can be persuaded with sweet phrases to accept a more equitable distribution of wealth is nothing less than delusional. As Trotsky once asked, how are tearful appeals to the decency of the rich better than prayers for rain? There is no way to settle accounts with the class that owns and controls the means of production and the global financial networks, along with gigantic military machines, intelligence agencies, and police forces, except through socialist revolution. But is this possible? At a certain stage of their development, Marx wrote, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. These words, in the most profound and immediate sense, define the historical situation that confronts present-day capitalism. For all their wealth and power, the ruling elites stagger from crisis to crisis. The ascendancy of Trump in the United States is only the most visible and ghoulish expression of the universal degeneracy of the capitalist class. But the ascendancy of Trump is of not only symbolic significance. Throughout the 20th century, and especially in the aftermath of World War II, the United States functioned as the ultimate guarantor of the stability and survival of the world capitalist system. It is incapable of playing that role any longer. For the past quarter century, American capitalism, seeking to offset through military operations the consequences of its protracted economic decline, has become the epicenter of geopolitical and financial instability. Within this situation, the resurgence of class struggle in the United States has immense historical significance. The upsurge of class struggle within the United States will imbue the international working class with renewed confidence in the possibility of defeating imperialism, and thereby accelerate the process of global working class radicalization. The laws of history, Trotsky proclaimed upon founding the Fourth International, are more powerful than the bureaucratic apparatus. That prognosis is now being vindicated. The working class is in the process of throwing off the shackles imposed by the old reactionary trade unions and their allies among the cynical organization of the petty bourgeois pseudo-left and its myriad forms of reactionary identity politics. The real progressive and revolutionary struggles of this epoch will be based on the universal emancipatory aspirations of the working class, not on the selfish strivings of one or another fragment of the upper middle class for identity-based privileges. On this historic May Day, the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, the International Committee of the Fourth International proudly proclaims that Trotskyism is the Marxism of the 21st century. We appeal to all our listeners throughout the world, to the hundreds of thousands of readers of the World Socialist Web Site, join our ranks, build new sections of the Fourth International, participate in the fight for the victory of the working class, and the establishment of a new and truly humane society based on the socialist principles of international solidarity and the equality of all mankind.